The image is dramatic. The headline writes itself. A fire breaks out aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford, the largest warship in the world, while it is operating in the Red Sea during one of the most tense military periods in the region. 2 sailors are hurt. The ship is on active deployment. And instantly, people want to know the same thing. Was this an attack? Was the carrier disabled? Is this the beginning of something much bigger? But when the first rush of emotion passes, the real story becomes more interesting and, in some ways, more important than the most explosive version of the headline. Because according to the U.S. military and multiple reports that cited the official statement, this was not a combat-related incident. The fire started in the ship's main laundry. It was contained. The 2 injured sailors were reported to have non-life-threatening injuries and to be in stable condition. And the Navy said there was no damage to the propulsion plant, meaning the carrier remained fully operational. That matters, because the difference between a contained onboard emergency and a combat hit is the difference between a maintenance and safety story and a major battlefield escalation. So let's slow this down and talk about what actually happened, why even a non-combat fire aboard a carrier is still a serious event, and what this incident does and does not tell us about U.S. naval power in the Red Sea right now. Because there are 2 mistakes people make in moments like this. One is to exaggerate everything into a civilization-ending crisis. The other is to dismiss every non-combat incident as meaningless. Both miss the point. When you're talking about a ship this large, this expensive, this heavily crewed, and this strategically important, even a fire in a laundry space deserves a careful look. First, the ship itself. The USS Gerald R. Ford, designated CVN-78, is the lead ship of the Ford class. It was commissioned in 2017. Official Navy materials and reference sources describe it as roughly 106 feet long, with a 100,000-ton full-load displacement powered by 2 nuclear reactors, and capable of carrying a large air wing. It is widely described as the largest aircraft carrier and the largest warship currently afloat. That size is part of why incidents on board capture so much public attention. This is not just another vessel. It is a symbol of U.S. military reach, logistics, engineering, and global presence. When something happens on this ship, however limited, it becomes news well beyond naval circles. Second, the timing. The Ford was reported to be operating in the Red Sea as part of the current U.S. military posture in the region. USNI reported on March 6th that the carrier had moved through the Suez Canal and into the Middle East area of operations. The Al Monitor and Reuters reports then placed the fire aboard the ship on March 12th, while it was in the Red Sea. In other words, this was not a training cruise near home. This happened while the ship was forward deployed in a region where military readiness, reaction time, and shipboard discipline matter constantly. That is one reason even a contained onboard fire becomes strategically relevant, not because it proves the ship is crippled, but because deployed warships operate in an environment where every onboard emergency tests procedures, crew response, and command resilience. Now, let's talk about the fire itself. Public reporting so far is narrow. The Navy statement, as quoted by news outlets, said the fire originated in the ship's main laundry. That tells us 2 important things. First, the incident appears to have come from a shipboard support area, not from aviation fuel operations, munition storage, reactor spaces, or propulsion. Second, because it was described as contained and because the ship remained fully operational, the crew appears to have done what modern navies train to do constantly: detect, isolate, and suppress damage fast enough to prevent escalation. Naval firefighting is one of the most fundamental forms of shipboard survival training because on a ship, fire is never just fire. It threatens electrical systems, ventilation, mobility, and sometimes the ability to continue operating at sea. The fact that the damage did not spread into a larger operational disaster is part of the story, and that leads to the human side, which should not get lost in the analysis. 2 sailors were injured. Reports say they were receiving treatment, their injuries were non-life-threatening, and they were stable. That is good news compared with what a worst-case shipboard fire can become, but it is still serious. Fires aboard ships injure people through heat, smoke, toxic inhalation, and the hazards of emergency response in tight spaces. Even a relatively localized incident can become physically dangerous fast. Because ship compartments are enclosed, access routes are narrow, and emergency teams often have to work in heavy gear under stressful conditions. When we talk about fully operational, that should not erase the reality that sailors were hurt while carrying out a deployment aboard one of the Navy's most important assets. So what should viewers not conclude from this? They should not conclude that the Ford was struck in combat. The official description specifically said the fire was not combat-related. They should not conclude that the carrier was mission-killed, dead in the water, or unable to operate aircraft. The Navy said there was no damage to the propulsion plant, and that the carrier remained fully operational. And they should not conclude, based on the available reporting, that this incident by itself proves some broad collapse of U.S. naval control in the region. That claim goes far beyond the evidence currently in public view. The facts support a serious onboard safety incident, not a verified combat defeat. At the same time, viewers also should not shrug and say, it was just laundry, so it doesn't matter. On a carrier, almost nothing is just anything. The operational value of a supercarrier depends on thousands of systems working together. Engineering, aviation, electrical distribution, damage control, food service, medical support, maintenance, sanitation, communications, and crew habitability. A ship like the Ford functions as a floating city, airport command node, and military platform all at once. Support spaces are part of what keeps the crew functioning during long deployments. A problem in a non-combat area can still reveal the importance of safety culture, equipment reliability, maintenance cycles, and how well crews manage wear and fatigue during high-tempo operations. That point becomes even more interesting because this was not the first mishap publicly associated with the Ford during this broader stretch of operations. The Al-Monitor report noted prior media reports about recurring toilet and sewage system problems aboard the ship. Those issues are obviously very different from a fire, and they should not be mashed together into one dramatic narrative. But they do point towards something worth discussing carefully: the gap between how people imagine giant, cutting-edge military systems and how those systems actually live in the real world. Modern warships are engineering marvels, but they are also dense, complicated, maintenance-heavy environments. The larger and more advanced the platform, the more there are things that can break, clog, fail, overheat, or demand constant attention. Technology does not eliminate friction. Often it multiplies the number of places where friction can appear, and that is why this story matters beyond the literal fire. It is really a story about the difference between headline power and operational reality. To the public, an aircraft carrier can look like an almost mythic object. Massive, nuclear-powered, loaded with aircraft, escorted by warships, and backed by one of the world's largest defense budgets. But inside that symbol are ordinary realities: laundry systems, berthing spaces, piping, wiring, ventilation, maintenance backlogs, training requirements, and people working long hours in a metal environment where mistakes can escalate. Military power is never just missiles, jets, and speeches. It is also hoses, valves, safety procedures, inspections, and how quickly a team can respond when smoke starts spreading where it shouldn't. There is also a broader historical point here. Fires have long been among the most feared hazards in naval operations, whether in combat or outside it. Carriers especially manage aviation fuel, electrical loads, machinery spaces, and thousands of people in a compact environment. Navies spend enormous time training damage control teams because at sea, distance from shore means you cannot simply call a city fire department and wait. The ship is the emergency system. The crew is the first responder. And every contained fire is a reminder of why damage control is treated almost like a fighting skill in its own right. That does not make this incident unique in naval history, but it does explain why professionals take such events seriously even when the ship remains mission capable. For the Navy, then, the public message is straightforward. The incident happened. It injured 2 sailors. It was contained. It was not combat related, and the ship remains able to operate. That is the kind of statement designed to reduce rumor-driven escalation while conveying the essentials. But for analysts and observers, there are still layers worth watching. Was the cause electrical, procedural, equipment-related, connected to workload or maintenance stress during an extended deployment? Those questions may eventually be answered through internal investigation, but as of the reporting currently available, we do not have enough verified information to go beyond the known facts. And saying we do not know yet is not weakness. It is how responsible analysis works when the evidence is still limited. Another reason this incident drew attention is because the Ford is not just any carrier. It is often presented as a flagship example of the Navy's next-generation design philosophy. That makes every mishap feel symbolic. Supporters see resilience when the ship keeps operating. Critics see vulnerability whenever anything goes wrong. But both sides sometimes forget that a single incident rarely proves a sweeping thesis. A contained laundry fire does not prove the ship is unreliable junk, and it also does not mean everything is perfect simply because operations continue. What it proves, at minimum, is that complex systems remain complex under deployment pressure. That is true of warships, aircraft, power plants, and almost every high-end machine humans build. If you step back, there is something almost revealing about how people reacted online. A lot of audiences today have been trained by algorithmic headlines to jump instantly to maximum drama. Fire becomes inferno. Injury becomes collapse. Incident becomes humiliation. But in the real world, especially in military operations, the truth is usually more layered. A non-combat fire can be both serious and contained. A deployed carrier can suffer an onboard emergency and still remain fully operational. 2 sailors can be injured without the event becoming evidence that the entire Navy has lost control. The temptation to turn every event into a final verdict is strong, but it usually produces bad analysis and worse reporting. That is why a stronger, smarter way to tell this story is not to oversell disaster, but to ask better questions. What does a carrier fire response actually look like on a forward-deployed nuclear-powered ship? How do crews contain smoke and heat in a floating environment packed with systems and people? What kinds of support spaces are most vulnerable to ordinary failures during long deployments? How much of modern military readiness is really about logistics, safety culture, maintenance discipline, and crew endurance rather than just combat capability? Those are the questions that keep viewers watching because they offer something more useful than panic. They offer understanding. And there is a strategic angle too, even without inventing one. The Ford's presence in the Red Sea matters because carriers are not deployed into tense regions just to exist on a map. They are signals of reach, deterrence, aviation capacity, and command presence. So, when anything happens aboard such a ship, even outside combat, people naturally ask whether readiness has changed. Based on the public reporting so far, the answer is that the Navy says the carrier remains operational. That does not end every question, but it does sharply limit what can honestly be claimed. If someone wants to argue that a contained laundry fire proves U.S. naval power has collapsed, the burden of evidence is far higher than what is currently public. In a way, the most meaningful phrase in all of this may be the least dramatic one, fully operational. Because that phrase does two jobs at once. It tells allies, adversaries, markets, and the public that the ship is still in the fight operationally. But it also highlights the standard by which carriers are judged. These ships are expected to absorb friction, solve problems, and keep moving. When that happens, it does not mean the incident was imaginary. It means the system did what it was designed and trained to do under stress. Whether that remains the case over time depends on investigations, maintenance follow-through, and lessons learned after the cameras move on. So here is the honest bottom line. What happened aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford was real, serious, and newsworthy. 2 sailors were injured in a non-combat related fire that started in the ship's main laundry while the carrier was operating in the Red Sea. The fire was contained, the sailors were reported stable, there was no damage to the propulsion plant, and the ship remained fully operational. Those are the facts supported by the reporting now in public. They do not justify turning the event into a fantasy of a carrier burning out of control, and they do not justify pretending it was nothing. They point to something more grounded, a major warship on deployment, experienced an onboard emergency, and the crew contained it before it became something worse. And that may actually be the more powerful story. Not the fake version where one incident becomes instant collapse, but the real version where even the world's biggest carrier remains vulnerable to ordinary hazards, where sailors still bear the human cost of keeping these machines running, and where military power is revealed not only by what weapons a ship carries, but by whether its crew can respond when something goes wrong inside the hull. In a moment when so much commentary is racing toward maximum panic, the most credible story is still the one built on facts. And right now, the facts say this was a contained onboard fire on a fully operational carrier, not the moment America's Navy lost control.